March 23, 1945, 2100 hours, western bank of the Rhine River near Wesel, Germany. The binoculars shook imperceptibly as Ost Wilhelm Steinberg scanned the darkening waters of the Rhine, recording observations in his field notebook that would later be found among captured German documents at Army Group headquarters. The Americans have reached our sacred river, but they cannot cross. No army has ever forced the Rhine against determined German resistance without bridges. Through the gathering dusk, he had just observed something that reinforced 3 years of Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. Artillery flashes illuminated the western bank. Thousands of guns preparing for what German commanders expected would be a traditional river assault, requiring days of preparation, fixed bridging operations, and vulnerable crossing points. Their 88mm guns could systematically destroy. In Germany, the Rhine had protected the nation for 2 millennia. Even now, with the Reich crumbling from east and west, military engineers assured commanders that the river's 1,300 feet width and swift currents made it impossible to cross without lengthy engineering preparations. 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, Black Watch, prepared to enter the water. Not invulnerable assault boats that would shuttle back and forth under fire, not waiting for engineers to complete pontoon bridges under artillery bombardment, but aboard vehicles that German intelligence had catastrophically failed to properly assess. The strange boat-shaped trucks designated DUKW had been observed in Normandy and Italy, but Weimar analysts dismissed them as specialized landing craft for beach operations irrelevant to river warfare. The mathematics of the Rhine defense were about to be shattered not by superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but by American industrial ingenuity that German defenders never imagined could be brought to bear on their last natural fortress. A systematic failure of intelligence that would transform Germany's uncrossable moat into a highway for Allied armor. The collapse had begun months earlier in German intelligence assessments. Oberstgablumantritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later testify to Allied interrogators about the Wehrmacht's fundamental misreading of American amphibious capabilities. Intelligence reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy had described Schwimmwahn, swimming trucks, but German analysts filed these among the curiosities of American excess, like ice cream ships and Coca-Cola battalions. Among the defenders was Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured after his surrender in April 1945, would provide historians with insight into German assumptions about Rhine defense. The Wehrmacht's most experienced officers, men who had studied river crossings from the Dnieper to the Seine, believed they understood the immutable laws of amphibious assault. Attackers needed overwhelming artillery superiority, specialized bridging equipment, and most critically, time to establish crossing points that defenders could target. But the first real revelation of German ignorance came in their assessment documents discovered at captured headquarters. Headman Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had compiled reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW exactly 3 times in 6 months of documentation. Each reference dismissed them as coastal operations equipment with no relevance to river warfare. The reports estimated American forces possessed perhaps 50 to 100 such vehicles in the entire European theatre. The reality was staggering. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs operated in the European theatre. The US Army had organized them into specialized amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. These units had practiced river crossing operations since Normandy, developing doctrine that German intelligence never detected. The British had received 2,000 DUKWs through Lend-Lease, adding their own operational innovations. Canadian forces operated 800 units with specialized cold weather modifications. The DUKW's development represented American problem-solving at its most efficient. In April 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat ran ground on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts, conventional trucks couldn't reach it through surf and sand. This minor incident sparked a revolution in amphibious warfare that would ultimately help destroy the Third Reich. Palmer Klett Putnam, working for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, partnered with yacht designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Piston to envision a truck that could transition seamlessly from water to land. When Ford Motor Company declined the project, claiming it was impossible to complete in the required time frame, General Motors Corporation accepted the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked around the clock. By June 2, 1942, just 38 days later, the first prototype rolled out. The vehicle combined a standard GMC WW2 1/2-ton truck chassis with a watertight hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens Yacht Architects. The designation DUKW came from GMC's nomenclature system. D for 1942 design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. The secret to the DUKW's versatility lay in several innovations. Frank Spear from GMC's engineering team developed the Central Tire Inflation System, CTIS, the world's first such system, allowing drivers to adjust tire pressure while moving. At 10 to 12 pounds per square in, the tires spread wide for sand and mud traction. At 40 to 45 psi, they provided highway efficiency. A 25-in propeller, driven through a transfer case from the main transmission, provided water propulsion at 5.5 knots, while a rudder linked to the steering wheel allowed seamless transition from water to land navigation. Major General Jacob Diaz observed the first demonstration in June 1942 and immediately ordered mass production. The initial contract called for 2,000 units. By war's end, GMC had manufactured 21,147 DUKWs at the unprecedented pace of 525 per month during peak production, each costing $10,750. Roughly the price of 7 Jeeps, but with capabilities that would prove priceless. March 1945 found Germany's Rhine defences in a state Wehrmacht commanders refused to acknowledge even to themselves. General Alfred Schlemm's First Parachute Army, the most effective German force remaining in the West, had been bled white in the Reichswald battles, losing 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The reinforcements arriving to defend the Rhine were Volkerm units, old men and boys with a few weeks' training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of uniforms. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division positioned near Wessel wrote in a letter to his wife dated March 20th, "The Americans are across from us now, thousands of them. We can hear their vehicles day and night. But the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon could not cross the Rhine against opposition. The engineers have destroyed every bridge, and our artillery has every possible crossing point registered." The defensive preparations appeared formidable on paper. Since September 1944, over 200,000 civilian labourers had been conscripted to strengthen the West Wall fortifications and extend them toward the Rhine. 3,000 concrete bunkers and gun positions had been constructed or reinforced. The river itself provided what German doctrine called the perfect water obstacle, too wide for assault bridges, too swift for boats, too deep for fooring. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, who had assumed command in the West after von Rundstedt's dismissal, issued orders that revealed German assumptions. The enemy will require 48 to 72 hours to establish viable bridgeheads after initial crossings. This window provides opportunity for counterattack with our mobile reserves. These mobile reserves consisted of 47 Panzer Corps with approximately 150 operational armoured vehicles, tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers combined to cover a front of nearly 200 metres. But the most critical German failure was conceptual. Wehrmacht doctrine, refined through 5 years of war, understood river crossings as sequential operations, suppress defenders with artillery, send infantry across in assault boats, establish small bridgeheads, begin bridge construction under fire, reinforce gradually as bridges were completed, then finally send armour across. Each phase provided defenders opportunities to concentrate fire and launch counterattacks. Unknown to German intelligence, the Allied forces had assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles in history along the Rhine's western bank. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs had been positioned in concealed areas within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle had been waterproofed, mechanically inspected, and loaded with specific cargo manifests that would maintain their water stability. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, recalled the meticulous preparation. "We knew this wasn't Normandy, with tides and beach obstacles. The Rhine was about current, about exit points, about coordinating with artillery, so we didn't get hit by our own shells. We practiced on the Rhine River for 2 weeks, learning how the DUWS handled in fast current. The vehicles themselves had been modified based on 3 years of combat experience. Armor plating protected drivers and vital mechanical components. Ring mounts for .050 caliber machine guns provided self-defense capability. Most critically, specialized bilge pumps could handle the water intake from small arms fire, allowing DUKWs to continue operating even when their hulls were perforated. Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company described the final briefing. "They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done. Use DUKWs as the primary assault vehicle for a major river crossing. Not support vessels, not supply carriers after the bridges were built, but the actual spearhead. Each duck would carry a full rifle squad with equipment, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and deposit troops directly into combat positions. The British forces had their own amphibious assets. The 79th Armoured Division under Major General Percy Hobart had brought 600 LVT 4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each capable of carrying 30 men. These would work alongside the American DUKWs in what would become the largest amphibious river crossing in military history. But it was the DUKWs, with their ability to seamlessly transition from water to land operations, that would prove most devastating to German assumptions. At 1,700 hours on March 23, 1945, the greatest artillery bombardment of the Rhine campaign commenced. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from 25-pounders to 240mm howitzers, unleashed a 4-hour barrage that seemed to turn the air itself into a solid wall of steel and explosive. German observers reported that the eastern bank appeared to be boiling under the impact of thousands of shells per minute. Gerrit Hinrich Müller, manning an observation post near Wessel, attempted to count the muzzle flashes across the river. I stopped at 500. It was like looking at a solid line of flame stretching north and south as far as I could see. The noise was beyond description. Not individual explosions, but one continuous roar that made thought impossible. Under cover of this bombardment and darkness, the first DUKWs entered the Rhine at 2,100 hours. The 51st Highland Division led the assault with the 7th Battalion Black Watch loaded into DUKWs operated by American crews. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers, plus its 2-man crew. Navigation lights shielded to be visible only from behind marked entry and exit points on both banks. Sergeant Robert McPhersonson of the Black Watch described the crossing. "We rolled down the bank and suddenly we were floating. The American driver just kept driving like we were still on land, except now water was rushing past. The engine noise was terrific, and we could hear German shells hitting the water around us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness and smoke. The current proved stronger than expected, 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. DUWs launched upstream of their intended landing points, their drivers calculating drift like navigators plotting aircraft courses in crosswinds. Some vehicles were swept hundreds of yards downstream, but their ability to drive up any reasonably sloped bank meant they could exit the river wherever they found themselves. By 2,200 hours, the first wave was across. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for second waves, instead heard only the continued roar of artillery. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and disappeared into the darkness. their passengers already engaging German positions from unexpected directions. As dawn broke on March 24th, German commanders began receiving reports that defied explanation. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland from crossing points in battalion strength with heavy weapons and supplies. The expected pattern of gradually expanding bridgeheads hadn't materialized. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. Headman Karl Rischert, commanding a battery of 88mm guns positioned to cover the crossing site at Rhine, reported to divisional headquarters. "Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat. Enemy armor is behind our position. How did they get across? All bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction. What Reich had encountered weren't tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns that had driven directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland. The vehicle's amphibious capability allowed them to bypass German strongpoints positioned to defend obvious routes from the riverbank. The scale of the operation became apparent as morning fog lifted. Hundreds of DUKWs were shuttling across the Rhine in continuous streams. Unlike assault boats that required engineer crews and were limited to perpendicular crossings at prepared sites, UKWs could enter and exit the river anywhere banks permitted. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing at dozens of points along a 22-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, operations officer for the 185th Division, recorded in his war diary, "The enemy has deployed a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never anticipated. Our defensive plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could target with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot engage so many targets simultaneously. The British Second Army's crossing at Wesel employed a devastating combination of DUKWs and Buffalo LVTS. The 15th Scottish Division crossed in Buffaloes, while DUKWs brought their heavy weapons and supplies. By 0800 hours, despite fierce resistance from the 1st Parachute Army, 3 full divisions were across the Rhine with their complete equipment loads. At 10 hours on March 24th, the thunder of aircraft engines added to the battle's cacophony. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in history, began as the massive air armada appeared over the Rhine. The operation involved more than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,350 gliders, carrying 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops. This wasn't the isolated paratroop drop German doctrine expected, but a coordinated hammer blow designed to work with the amphibious assault. Oberreiter Franz Fieber of the 84th Infantry Division watched from his position near Hamkel. The sky turned black with aircraft. Parachutes bloomed like flowers, thousands upon thousands. We thought this was the main assault, that the river crossings were diversions. Then we learned the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. The airborne forces, the US 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions, landed within artillery range of the Rhine crossings, something German commanders hadn't anticipated. Previous airborne operations had dropped paratroopers far behind enemy lines to operate independently. This time they landed just 6 miles from the river, directly supporting the amphibious forces. The coordination between airborne and amphibious forces multiplied their effectiveness. DUKWs carrying ammunition and medical supplies drove directly to airborne positions that in previous operations would have required air supply or link up with ground forces. Days later, wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs, returning to the Western Bank, something impossible in traditional airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne later wrote, "We were fighting for this crossroads when these Wehrmacht-looking truck boats came driving up. No splashing, no bogging down. They just drove out of the woods like regular trucks, except we knew they'd just crossed the Rhine." The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo?" We thought we were hallucinating. By noon on March 24th, the full implications of the DUKW assault became clear to German commanders. This wasn't just a new way to cross rivers. It was a complete revolution in amphibious logistics that invalidated every assumption in their defensive planning. Traditional river crossings required sequential phases. assault crossing, bridgehead consolidation, bridge construction, and finally supply build-up. Each phase was vulnerable to counterattack. Bridges once built became critical choke points that concentrated targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs eliminated these vulnerabilities. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, logistics officer for the 16th Corps, had established what he called DUKW highways across the Rhine. Vehicles loaded on the western bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. No unloading at the river bank, no transfer to different vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point, Sims reported. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies or 25 men. That's 125 tons of supplies or 1,250 troops every hour around the clock. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any, just trucks driving through water. The psychological impact on German defenders was devastating. Feldwebel Hermann Gutz of the 2nd Parachute Regiment wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Supply sergeants reported surreal experiences. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division described establishing a supply dump. "We're 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side, right? And here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it in the duck, and it drove straight to us, hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were insane." March 25th dawned with German commanders facing a situation Wehrmacht doctrine had never addressed. The Rhine, Germany's historic barrier, had become irrelevant, not conquered, not breached, but simply bypassed by American industrial ingenuity that German intelligence had dismissed as a curiosity. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, held a commander conference that morning in a farmhouse near Brunnen. The surviving record of this meeting, compiled from testimonies of captured officers, reveals the depth of German dismay. Schlemm reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it. The numbers were staggering. In the first 48 hours, DUKWs had transported over 15,000 troops across the Rhine. More critically, they had moved 1,200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and light armor. That traditional crossing methods wouldn't have delivered for days. Artillery pieces were being fed across and firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence even confirmed the crossings had occurred. Oberst Hinrich von Lüttichau, commanding the remnants of Panzer Brigade 106, attempted to counterattack near Wsel on March 25th. His unit's war diary records, "Attacked toward river to destroy enemy bridgehead. Found no bridgehead in traditional sense. Enemy forces distributed across 15 kilometers front with no apparent center. Swimming vehicles continuously reinforcing all points. Impossible to identify critical target. Attack failed with heavy losses. The British were achieving similar success. The Scottish divisions had pushed 6 miles inland by end of March 25th, supported by continuous DUKW supply runs. Royal Artillery forward observers were calling in fire missions while riding in DUKWs, using the vehicle's mobility to avoid German counterb fire. The Rhine crossing starkly exposed the industrial asymmetry between American mass production and German craftsmanship philosophy. While German engineers had developed their own amphibious vehicle, the land was a Schleer LWS. The production comparison revealed everything about why Germany lost the war. The LWS was in many ways superior to the DUKW. It could carry 20 men compared to the DUKW's 25, but it had better armor protection. Its tracked design provided superior performance in mud and snow. German engineers had solved complex problems of waterproofing track systems and creating reliable bilge gauge pumps. As a piece of engineering, it was remarkable. But Germany had produced only about 100 units total, with even fewer seeing operational service. The LWS required specialized components, skilled craftsmen for assembly, and rare materials for its armor and waterproofing. Each unit cost approximately 75,000 Reichsmarks, 7 times the cost of a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors had produced 21,147 DUKWs, using existing truck components and assembly line methods. The vehicle shared its engine, transmission, axles, and countless other parts with the standard CCKW truck, of which 562,750 were built. This standardization meant any mechanic familiar with military trucks could maintain a DUKW. Spare parts were abundant. Damaged vehicles were quickly repaired or cannibalized. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, maintenance chief for the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company, explained the advantage. We kept 90% of our ducks operational throughout the crossing. When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't have the parts, we could adapt something from a regular truck. Try doing that with some specialized German wonder weapon. The production philosophy extended beyond mere numbers. American DUKWs were designed for ease of operation. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to operate a DUKW in a few hours. German vehicles required extensively trained crews. American mass production assumed operators would be citizen soldiers with minimal training. German design assumed professional soldiers with months of preparation. Personal accounts from both sides of the Rhine reveal the human dimension of this technological and tactical revolution. These were not abstract production statistics or strategic assessments, but young men experiencing the transformation of warfare in real time. Private First Class James H. of the 89th Infantry Division recalled his first sight of the DUKWs. We were lined up on the West Bank, expecting to crowd into assault boats under fire like we'd trained. Then these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down the bank. A Navy guy, Navy, in the middle of Germany, waves us aboard. I asked him, "What the hell is this thing?" He grinned and said, "Your taxi to Berlin, soldier." The presence of US Navy personnel operating DUKWs deep in continental Europe added to German confusion. Seaman's Second Arse Robert Moody, assigned to naval detachment operating DUKWs for the Rhine crossing, described the German reaction. We captured some Germans who just stared at our Navy uniforms. One who spoke English kept asking, "How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 meters away." He simply couldn't process what he was seeing. German accounts reveal progressive demoralization as the scope of American amphibious capability became clear. Lieutenant Friedrich Schulze of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter captured after his unit's surrender. They came across the river like it was a street. Not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barges, but driving, trucks full of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We shot at them, but more kept coming. Always more. Where did they get so many? Unratsier Paul Brown, captured on March 26th, told interrogators, "We were told the Rhine would stop you for weeks, that you would have to build bridges we would destroy, that your assault boats would be easy targets for our guns. Nobody told us about swimming trucks, nobody warned us you could cross anywhere, anytime. We prepared for the wrong war." By March 26th, 1945, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defensive position had completely collapsed. What Wehrmacht doctrine insisted would take weeks had been accomplished in 3 days. The Rhine barrier, which propaganda claimed would hold until negotiations could save something of the Reich, had evaporated. The statistics from those 3 days revealed the revolution's scope. DUKWs had completed over 5,000 individual crossings. They had transported 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and evacuated 2,000 wounded. Traditional bridging operations, had they been required, would have needed 2 weeks to achieve similar throughput while under constant attack. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for excessive caution, had achieved complete operational surprise through the mass employment of amphibious vehicles. His after-action report noted, "The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it." The distinction proved fatal to their defense. General Dwight Eisenhower visited the crossing sites on March 26. His reaction, recorded by aide Captain Harry Butcher, was telling. Ike watched the DUKWs streaming back and forth like a ferry service. He turned to Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied, "The Germans are just figuring that out." The psychological collapse was complete. Yes, Goebbels' diary entry for March 26 read, "The situation in the West has become impossible. The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front with a new type of amphibious vehicle we failed to anticipate. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." March 27 saw the full exploitation of the Rhine breakthrough. With German forces in complete disarray, Allied commanders unleashed their mobile forces. The DUKWs, having accomplished their amphibious mission, now revealed another capability. They could operate as regular trucks, advancing with the armored spearheads. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been fed across in record time. Tank crews described the surreal experience of following DUKWs that had just emerged from the Rhine, still dripping water as they raced down German autobahns. The amphibious vehicles carried fuel and ammunition directly to advancing tank units, eliminating the traditional pause for supply build-up after a river crossing. Major General Isaac White, commanding the 2nd Armored, reported, "We advanced 50 miles on March 27th alone. In any previous operation, we would have been waiting for bridges to be completed and supplies to be stockpiled. Instead, the DUKWs kept pace with us. They'd cross rivers we encountered, scout for crossing sites, and establish supply points before our main body arrived. German resistance crumbled into isolated pockets. Units that had prepared to counterattack bridgeheads found themselves bypassed by Allied forces that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. The rigid German defensive doctrine, based on identifying and destroying fixed crossing points, had no answer for hundreds of amphibious vehicles, creating their own crossing points at will. Aust Hans von Luck, one of Germany's most experienced armoured commanders, encountered American forces near Dorst on March 28. His memoir describes the meeting. "My battalion was racing to establish a blocking position when we encountered American troops already dug in. I asked a captured lieutenant how they had moved so quickly. He pointed to a line of those amphibious trucks and said, 'We don't wait for bridges.' It was then I truly understood that Germany had lost more than a battle. We had lost an entire form of warfare. The full impact of the DUKW on the Rhine crossing extends beyond the impressive statistics of vehicles and supplies transported. The amphibious trucks had fundamentally altered the mathematics of river assault, creating advantages that compounded exponentially. Traditional river crossings concentrated forces at specific points, creating targets for artillery and air attack. The DUKWs dispersed crossings along the entire front, diluting German firepower. Wehrmacht doctrine called for counter-attacking bridgeheads before they could consolidate, but there were no traditional bridgeheads, just continuous infiltration across a broad front. Colonel William Thompson, who commanded DUKW operations for the 9th Army, calculated the time savings. Building a heavy pontoon bridge under fire typically took 12 to 24 hours minimum. During that time, you could only reinforce by assault boat, maybe a company per hour if things went well. We were moving a battalion per hour with DUKWs from the first minute of the operation. The medical impact was profound, but often overlooked. Captain Dorothy Anderson, a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital, described the evacuation system. Wounded soldiers were loaded into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven directly to our hospital on the western side. No transfer between vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were getting casualties to surgery within an hour of being wounded. That simply wasn't possible in traditional river crossings. The DUKWs also enabled tactical innovations impossible with conventional crossing methods. Artillery forward observers could relocate rapidly in DUKWs, making German counter-fire ineffective. Engineers used DUKWs to transport bridge sections, actually accelerating traditional bridge construction, even as they made it less critical. Radio relay stations in DUKWs maintained communications across the water barrier. Post-war analysis revealed the depth of German intelligence failure regarding American amphibious capabilities. The Wehrmacht had observed DUKWs in multiple operations: Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, yet never grasped their strategic implications for river-crossing operations. General Major Reinhard Gehlen, Chief of Foreign Armies East and later founder of West German intelligence, admitted in his memoirs, "We catalogued American equipment meticulously. We knew about the DUKW. We simply never imagined they would mass hundreds of them for a river crossing. Our thinking was constrained by our own limitations. Because we could only produce a handful of amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans faced similar constraints." Captured German intelligence files revealed systematic underestimation. A February 1945 assessment by Army Group H estimated Allied forces possessed approximately 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations. The actual number was over 2,000 inches, the 21st Army Group alone. Another report dismissed DUKWs as useful for supply operations after beaches are secured but unsuitable for assault operations. The failure went beyond mere numbers. German intelligence never identified the specialized amphibious truck companies, never detected their training exercises on the Maas River, never recognized the doctrinal revolution underway. They were preparing to fight the river crossing they expected, not the one that actually occurred. Major Joachim Engelmann, intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, testified after capture. "We studied every Allied river crossing from the Rapido to the Seine. We thought we understood their methods. The massed employment of amphibious vehicles simply wasn't in our calculations. It was as if they had developed the ability to fly tanks across the river, completely outside our